Good evening. Welcome to the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe and to the Writers Festival's 2021 virtual season. My name is Sean Wilson. On behalf of the Ottawa International Writers Festival and the Ottawa Public Library, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event on the new age of empire, how racism and colonialism still rule the world. I want to thank you in advance for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, but I know that wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby who would be more than happy to sell you some great books. Just like last fall, all our programming, weekly video interviews, and our Friday podcast will be available free and on demand at writersfestival.org. So all you need to do to connect with some of the world's most acclaimed authors and thinkers is visit us online and press play. Please consider making a donation to support our virtual programming, as it may be a long while before we're able to gather again in person. Your financial support will allow us to continue to bring you the world's most interesting authors and thinkers. Now, let's turn it over to our host, CBC's Adrian Harewood, the award-winning co-host of CBC Ottawa News and the host of Our Ottawa. An acclaimed broadcaster, careful reader, and skilled interlocutor, I'm pleased to introduce our host, Ottawa's own Adrian Harewood.
Thanks so much, Sean, for that very kind introduction, and welcome to you all. Certainly looking forward to tonight's discussion. Dr. Kehinde Andrews is a professor of Black Studies in the School of Social Sciences at Birmingham City University. He is the first Black Studies professor in the UK and helped found the first Black Studies program in Europe at the university. In addition, he is the director of the Center for Critical Social Research, founder of the Harambee Organization of Black Unity, and co-chair of the UK Black Studies Association. Andrews has written 3 books, including Resisting Racism, Race Inequality, and the Black Supplementary School Movement, and Back to Black, retelling the Black, Back to Black, retelling Black radicalism. That's quite a mouthful there, for the 21st century. He also edits the Blackness in Britain book series. His most recent book, of course, is entitled The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. And Dr. Kehinde Andrews, welcome to the Ottawa Writers Festival and the Ottawa Public Library event. Thanks for joining us.
No, thank you. It's good to be virtually be here, I guess.
Kehinde, I'm looking at the book, your new book. It's in the background. It's on your bookshelf. And I will say that a couple of days ago, I think I saw your kids. Your kids were celebrating the arrival of this book online. They seem pretty excited.
I think I made a video. I would say they volunteered to do this video, but for the publication day in the UK, they made a really nice video where they're all celebrating the book, and they have no idea what it's about. But at least they can say the title because they're quite young. My oldest son is only 8. So.
Okay. Well, we're going to get to the book, but I wanted to talk a little bit about you and where you came to be, your journey to here. And I was curious about where your politics have come from. How would you describe your own kind of political formation and your own evolution as a thinker?
Well, really, I mean, I'm fortunate enough to have grown up as a legacy of the British Black Power movement. So my father was one of the founders of the Harambee Organization, an organization that started in 1972 in the UK in Birmingham, where I still live. And actually, I'm now the co-chair of the chair of the Harambee Organization of Black Unity. My mum worked for the Commission for Racial Equality in the UK, which is like a race relations body that came out of the 1965 Racial Relations Act, and also volunteered in the Harriet Tubman bookshop that we had in Birmingham. And all these books actually that I have behind me, most of them I just stole from my parents' house when I left. And I think one of the things that we take for granted now is it's so easy to access information. Like you can just get any book you want. It comes to your door. It's really easy. Whereas in the 60s, 70s, there was nothing. It was really difficult. And so in the UK, the British Black Power movement predominantly was about bringing in these books, of opening bookshops. My first book was about the Black Supplementary School movement, which was people basically, because the racism in the mainstream schools was so bad that we just started our own schools, had our own education. And there was a kind of space of this Black study space in the UK where I was lucky, everybody is not as fortunate as me to grow up with the library like this, and then to be able to read this stuff. So that's where I got my education from. And none of it was really in school, college, or university.
Well, tell us, what was it like being around the Andrews kitchen table growing up in the 1980s, particularly when it comes to the kinds of political conversations, the debates that were going on in your household?
Yeah, I mean, we just had a different, like for me, it's always been very natural to talk about blackness, talk about race, to talk about, like, we think we have Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Black Panther Party, Angela Davis. This is the kind of stuff that we just grew up knowing, like about slave rebellions in the Caribbean, people like Queen Nzinga in Angola, Queen Nanny in Jamaica. Like I said, I was volunteered at the Harriet Tubman bookshop as a young person. So like, that's just how it was. Like, I don't know, like we just always discussed this kind of thing. And I think that's really important because what we've had over the last, let's say probably since the 80s, 90s, there's been kind of more of a retrenchment where and I'm part of this, right? So I work in a university, people have managed to integrate into jobs, and maybe we've kind of expected the mainstream system to deliver education, but it don't do that, right? And so actually a lot of the spaces which I came up in don't necessarily exist anymore in the same way. So the bookshops are closing down. You have supplementary schools, but not to the same extent. We don't really have the same, it's just different. It's different for young people coming up now. And I think actually that's one of the things I would really stress is in terms of something like Black Studies, it's not new at all in the UK. It's just been outside the community. It's been outside the university for a long time, and we need to go back. I think for me, a lot of it is about how do we go back and put in that community education, community knowledge.
Mm-hmm. I remember the first time reading authors like Chinua Achebe. And I remember reading, for example, James Baldwin as a maybe 13-year-old, 14-year-old, reading Another Country and the impact that book had on me. Reading Roots as well, Alex Haley's Roots. What were the books that kind of shaped you as a young person that you remember reading, you remember tackling?
I mean, I think the first book as a teenager that I read, like really political book that really changed a lot of the way that I thought, was Stokely Speaks, From Black Power to Pan-Africanism. And I actually have the book here, but the front cover fell off. And the front cover, it was Stokely. He's got his little afro and his glasses, and he's holding a gun over his head, and he looks ridiculous. And I actually only picked up the book because I thought it'd be funny. Like, what's this nonsense? What's this? And so, but when I read it, completely changed everything. Honestly, like,
what did it change for you, Kehinde? What did it change?
I mean, I guess, as because I said, as a young person, obviously I grew up with this, but then you kind of, everybody rebels against their parents, isn't it? So I kind of went through a stage at secondary school where I didn't want to hear all the black stuff. I wasn't that interested. Most of my friends were white at one point. Like, I just was rejecting all of that. And if you'd ask me, actually ask anybody who knew me when I was 12, 13, like early years of high school, they'd be really surprised what I've They'd be like, what this guy's talking about blackness. But it was when I opened that book, I'd say like 14, 15, it just made everything made sense. It just, even though it was 50 years ago, no, probably 40 years ago, at that point, even though it was thousands of miles away, it just explained the experiences I was having in school, explained the experiences I've seen on the street. Just explained things really, 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 really clearly. And then just opened up. So I then read Malcolm X. I then read Assata Shakur's autobiography. And Malcolm X talks about when he was in prison and when he started reading, it was like snow falling off a roof. Like, it was just one day he's there and the next day it's just changed that swift. And I had that exact same experience where I just opened my eyes. And since then, I see the world in a different way, I think.
And how were you informed by the rich tradition, the rich Black British radical tradition? When I think of that tradition, I think, for example, the first name that comes to mind is someone like C.L.R. James, the author of the Black Jacobins, Beyond a Boundary, of course, some of the seminal pieces of literature of the 20th century, a Marxist, part of the Johnson Forest tendency. I think about, for example, the likes of Stuart Hall, or you think of Paul Gilroy, or many others. So who were the kind of members of the Black radical tradition that informed your thinking?
Yeah, so one of the things about in that kind of in the Black radical space, the border, there really are no borders. And so, like, if I pick up Malcolm, like, Malcolm's my absolute favorite. I'm like absolutely 100% Malcolm. It doesn't resonate any less picking up Malcolm than picking up, say, I don't know, Claudia Jones. Like, Claudia Jones, really important. Absolutely. Probably in terms of people in Britain, in the Black radical tradition, Claudia Jones, probably seminal, I would say. And there's really is this like a proper exchange of ideas and knowledge. And so, in some senses, yeah, I'd definitely say Claudia Jones. I'd definitely say Marcus Garvey. I mean, the Garvey, and not just Marcus Garvey, but the Garveys. So Amy Jakes Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, I mean, they're the most important in Black radical traditions in America as well. Actually, we just kind of written them out. We just kind of forgotten that the Universal Negro Improvement Association was the blueprint, the largest organization, influenced everything else that came before. So certainly the Garveys, and I've got the philosophy and opinions there somewhere. It's like a Bible in, and as I'm Caribbean, like my family's mostly Jamaican, and so there's a big Garvey Rasta tradition as well in the UK, which is really important. So yeah, I'd say those would be the key ones. But also just everything like Walter Rodney, actually really interesting how Europe underdeveloped Africa. C.L.R. James, obviously, but then also the African writers. So people like Nkrumah, Amilcar Cabal's work's really interesting as well. So there's a proper, yeah. I mean, the UK is this respect. It's just interesting because the UK is so small as a place, and because everybody's a migrant or like recently a migrant, so we've all got migrants in our families. For us, diaspora is really important, and there is a kind of seamlessness the way that we'll read the literature, where being in the UK doesn't necessarily make it more relevant, but there are some really interesting people who have come through the UK as well.
Mm-hmm. So you were an activist, you are an activist, but you ended up going into the academy, and the academy is, still is a rather conservative institution. How is one able to exist as a Black radical, the Black radical that you are, within this very conservative construct called the academy?
Well, I was by my own definition, Back to Black, which is all about what is Black radicalism. I can't even say I'm radical because of the location which I am in the university. And the university is terrible. Like, there is this idea that the university is left wing, that it's progressive, that it's like the universities are deeply conservative, deeply racist institutions. I mean, in the UK, I am one of 140 Black professors, full professors in the entire country, which is 0.68% of all professors. Like, it's really bad. Like, there's most places don't hire Black people at all. And it is an alienating place, and it's difficult to do a lot of this work. So honestly, there is a question which, if you ask me, do I see myself as being an academic forever? I'd probably say no. I'd say I hope not, actually, because these institutions really are the problem. And the work that we want to do, that we should want to do, that who are all the... So what we've done with Black Studies, we brought in this kind of community knowledge, like the intellectuals, people like Malcolm, people like Claudia, people like Amy Jakes. And the question I always ask myself is, if we could, let's say you could take Malcolm and put him in a university, would that even be a good thing? Like, why would you want to do that? That would just like ruin Malcolm if he became an academic. So surely we should be trying to say, well, we should be trying to create knowledge outside of these institutions. So it is a contradiction, which I'm not sure I've dealt with.
But what is the university allowing you to do? Is the university, partially responsible for the production of this new book of yours, The New Age of Empire?
Yeah, I mean, no, but that's the thing, right? So in some ways, what other job could I do this stuff? Like, this is the other thing, right? Like, what other job could I possibly have where I could come here, spend my time doing this, write Back to Black, write The New Age of Empire? They have... One of the things I say at my uni, they don't care. Like, there's no... I can say whatever I like, and I never get any pushback. So there's no pushback in terms of creating the knowledge. I guess there's a metaphor I used the other day, actually, I quite like, where if you think about on the plantation, there was this role of the slave pastor, right, who would go around and preach. And the purpose of their role was to pacify the enslaved, right? It was to keep us down. It was to, teach us that kind of turn the other cheek religion and to control us. That was the purpose of it. And in many ways, that is what the purpose of a professor is. That's what academics do. That's what the system does. But if you actually look at who was it that started many of the rebellions on the plantations, it was the slave pastor, right? Why? Because they could read, so they had access to. It was a privileged position where they had access to reading material, different ideas. They were some of the only few people who could travel, the enslaved who could travel around and talk to big congregations of people. So that privilege that was supposed to make them pacify people was turned around to start rebellion and revolution. And I guess if I can say myself in that role, right, can we subvert what our actual privileges in order to do radical work, then that's great. But then if you actually look at what's the end point of that? It's still like revolution, right? So the solution isn't staying in the university. The solution is using the university to do other things. And I guess that's probably the end point of this project, I guess.
Well, let's talk about this new book of yours, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. I'm curious as to where this book came from. What are its kind of roots? What are its origins?
It's really a prequel to Back to Black. So the book I wrote, 2018, Back to Black. You are right, it's a mouthful. Back to Black, retelling Black radicalism for the 21st century. It's very much, what is the solution? What is the Black Revolution, etc. I spent a lot of time, talked to a lot of people about the book, and it was very clear that people were like, yeah, I get it, but they weren't convinced of the scale of the problem, right? So the New Age of Empire is a prequel. This is explaining why you need revolution, explaining why reform isn't going to work, explaining why Black professors isn't the answer. This is kind of the book which says, let's really understand how that white supremacy is the very nature of the political and economic system which we inhabit. There is no way that you can reform it or change it. Within it, you have to get rid of it and do something else. So that's kind of where the book comes from.
Colonialism and imperialism are often imagined as existing in this kind of distant past. They're seen as hearkening back to another time, possibly in the 20th century. We think about, of course, the anti-colonial movements that led to the independence of many nations in the global South. But you argue, though, in your book that colonialism and imperialism are very much part of our present. Can you explain how?
Yeah, so what I try to, the term I use in the book is the logic of empire, right? And this hasn't changed. This is the key thing. So things definitely look different now, but they're not different. There's still the same basic logic behind them. It just manifests differently, which is why the book's called The New Age of Empire. So if we think about what the key difference is, it's from 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and found the Americas until the Second World War, really. That's kind of the first version of the West, of the Western Empire, which is brutally violent. I mean, the most violent system which has ever existed on the planet, killed far more people than any other thing in the history of ever. If you go from the genocide in the Americas, which is estimated to be like 60 to 70 million people, which is just an insane number. Then you take slavery, which is another 50 plus million. Then you take colonialism, which it would be probably impossible to add up all the numbers.
And we don't talk about the numbers enough, you think?
We don't.
We're not aware of the scale of the devastation, the scale of the brutality.
No, it's true. We really don't. Like, I was surprised. I have to say, like, when I looked at that number of the natives in the Americas, even I was surprised. Like, wow, is that many? Like, it's
it was annihilation.
I mean, there's no other term for it. It's extermination, annihilation. It's genocide, right? In Haiti and Dominican Republic, what they called Hispaniola, when Columbus landed, the midpoint estimate of people, so it could be higher, it could be lower, that inhabited the island was 8 million, which was totally shocked me because we kind of have this idea of the noble savage, and there's a few of them fishing and hunting, and a few of them died, but whatever. The midpoint estimate is 8 million. And that was in 1492. By the time Columbus leaves in 1512, there's estimated to only be 20,000 people left. I mean, just imagine the scale of devastation. And it gets even worse after that. No, not 20,000, sorry. 200. I'm actually, because I still can't really grasp the number. 200 people left by 1512. I mean, it is literally extermination, annihilation. And that is the kind of first act which allows you to have the Atlantic slave trade, which again, we're talking about tens of millions of people. And then colonial atrocities. For instance, in Belgium, 10 million Congolese. And by the time, when I wrote the genocide chapter, I think I ended up depressed just looking at all the figures and the numbers, and it really is unimaginable. And even now, we haven't really got the scale. So I've been heavily criticized in the British media a number of times for politely pointing out that the British Empire did far more damage and lasted far longer than the Nazis. I mean, in no doubt about it, right? The British Empire lasted for 200 to 300 years, killed tens of millions of people through genocidal acts of slavery, colonial acts, atrocities. I mean, that's not a controversial statement if we actually understand its history. It's just a factual statement, right? Nazis were terrible. British Empire was the Nazis for 200 years, right? But we just don't think about it we don't think about it in those terms, which is deeply problematic, right?
Why is it controversial? Why is it deemed to be dangerous or radical to state what you're saying are just the facts?
It's because the way that we're taught the history is important to maintaining the status quo. So if we were to actually really understand just the devastation which brought about the West, we'd have to rethink, right? We'd have to say, well, actually, yeah, like reparations, you have to start thinking about things like reparations. You have to start thinking about guilt and about how do you repair, what do you do about that, right? Also, particularly the Nazis and defeating the Nazis, that's actually interesting. It's an interesting turning point where you get this new age of empire, where the Nazis are used as this, oh, look at this horrendous anti-modern contradiction, like we need to get rid of that, and we're going to get rid of race, we're going to get rid of these kind of these genocidal maniacs, and we're going to have this wonderful new age where it's globalization, America's the heart, etc. And this kind of, if you trace where all the myths about since 45 to now come from, the defeat of the Nazis is huge in that. So if you suggest that actually no, the Nazis weren't an aberration, they were just the latest version of colonial atrocities. The only real difference is in Europe rather than outside of Europe. Is to undo a key myth, like the Britain in particular, but America as well. That defeat of the Nazis and them as being evil is a really important myth that holds everything together. So we know we're not racist because we're not Nazis, right? I mean, think about how that still plays out in America now. Joe Biden, he's not a racist because the racists are the neo-Nazis who are in the Capitol. So we can say, look, that's what a racist looks like, and we're not racist. And that takes away all of the culpability for everything else and everything else that goes on. So it's a really important myth to hold it together, I think.
Well, this book is about myth busting in many ways. You're trying to debunk some of these myths, and particularly with regards to our understanding or conception of the West. So to your mind, look, what is the kind of popular understanding of what constitutes the West and its origins as well?
Well, the popular view really is the three great revolutions of science. So science, ingenuity, these great thinkers, etc. Industrial revolution, right? So mechanization, factories, cotton, the cotton gin, etc. And politics, right? So democracy is a big one, right? So we think what makes the West generally, how we understand it, is any countries which have political revolution, have science, and have a modern industry, right?
And they're products of the Enlightenment. Maybe you can talk about the Enlightenment.
Oh yeah. And Enlightenment values, Enlightenment reason, not religious. So like it's a big thing at the minute. The clash of civilizations between with Islamic Caliphate. That's the kind of, if you think about now how it's defined in a big way, is this kind of religious explanations, those kind of backwards ideas, etc. That's not the West. The West is this advanced, progressed industry, right? Well, that's fine, right? It's not untrue. All right, I wouldn't say it was untrue, but in saying that, what you've missed is that all of those things are possible in the West only because of the colonial violence which accompanied them, right? So if you think about the Enlightenment is a powerful idea about how knowledge spreads out of Europe to the rest of the world, enlightens the rest of the world. I mean, that is simply white identity politics. I mean, there's nothing short of that. It's completely untrue. At the time when Europe comes to, in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Europe is behind everywhere, literally everywhere. Europe is probably the only place in the world in the Dark Age. Africa's more advanced, Asia's more advanced. As we said, the Americas are more advanced. And between 1492 and the Enlightenment, which is like 18th century, what happens is the colonial violence literally destroys so many parts of the world, lays waste to so much of the world and dominates the world, that by the time you have thinkers like Immanuel Kant, even Jefferson's an Enlightenment thinker, Hume, etc., by the time they come about, Europe's on top, right? Europe's on top of the world. We know that Africans are inferior because they're enslaved. We know that the natives in the America are a feeble race because they no longer exist, right? We know that Indians can be a less than because we're colonizing them. And then they build a theory around this, which justifies the colonial brutality and expansion. So you can't have the knowledge that we have. You definitely can't have the Industrial Revolution without things like slavery, colonialism, etc. And then the political revolution is based off the plenty, the bounty, the amount of money and wealth which is exploited off the people in the colonies, is that allows an equality of life here, which then allows for democracy. So those three great revolutions simply can't happen without colonial violence and brutality.
But I'm wondering if you're being a bit reductionist there. You know, you're saying that the Enlightenment was really about white identity politics. Surely it was more than that, though. The American revolutionaries saw themselves as fighting for a certain kind of freedom, freedom from, you know, they were trying to separate themselves from the colonial masters in Britain. They felt that they were engaged in a monumental struggle that resulted in the emergence of the first kind of, you know, one could argue, democracy to emerge in the modern world. So is it only, was the Enlightenment only about white identity politics?
Yes, no, I mean, yeah, I mean, actually, like, so before I wrote the book, I probably would have given you a slightly different answer. Actually, going into it, no, it's simply just white identity politics. America is a perfect example. So you have this idea of freedom and the vote and democracy, etc. All men are created equal from slave owners, from a bunch of slave owners who actually held.
But Kehinde, that was a radical at the time. That was a radical idea, right? The fact that an ordinary person should have the right to participate in their own in the organization of politics in this society, right? Because that had been the preserve of the monarchies of the king and the queen, well, right?
It was different in Europe and for white people. So at the point, the idea of participation in government for the ordinary person that's not a new idea. It's not a European idea. It's not an Enlightenment idea. In fact, if you go to African societies for thousands of years, that pre-existed. So I do count that for Europeans, this was a new thing, right? But it also wasn't a radical idea for the enslaved. So this is the thing we have when we tell that story of history and say, well, look, at for white people, it was great. We were there and we were enslaved. So this clearly wasn't good for us, right? In fact, nothing changed. In fact, it probably got worse. There's a large argument you can make that when America becomes independent, no, actually it does. Actually, in numbers terms, in terms of brutality, in terms of the shift to cotton, actually slavery gets worse in America after independence. So obviously these great ideals aren't passed down to us, right? Now, importantly, why I say it's white identity politics, and is because if you actually look at the theory of rights you get from the Enlightenment, is a theory of rights which justifies the slavery of black people at the time, clearly, otherwise they wouldn't have carried on, right? Because we're not seen to be human. And the thing about it is now it's also the same theory of rights that justifies black death today, right? So for instance, we have this universe. So what's the best way to explain this? We have this universal framework of rights that everybody has the right to life, right? And that's the only thing you're guaranteed is the right to life. You're not guaranteed the right to prosperity. You're not guaranteed the right to eat. You're not guaranteed the right to anything else, the right to life. What that does is that freezes the economy in the image of white supremacy, right? So if you think about it now, Africa is the poorest continent on the planet by a distance, sub-Saharan Africa. The places where white people live, the West is the richest, and you have this hierarchy in between. White supremacy. So if you read the writings of any of the Enlightenment thinkers, they all believe that Africans were inferior, Europeans were superior, and there was a hierarchy in between. It cannot be a coincidence that is actually what the world looks like today. Like that doesn't just happen. We literally built the world in the image of white supremacy. And then the theory of rights that we have says, okay, as long as they can kind of eat and we'll give them vaccinations sometimes, maybe we don't always even want to do that, then it's fine, but we don't have to actually deal with the global imbalances. How do we have the United Nations talking about global poverty and not talking about race? When race is the main thing. Like, it's the biggest thing. Like, the biggest thing that explains your life chances around the world is race. But we have a framework of development that never talks about race. That's not coincidental, right? That's from the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. You really take to task the kind of Enlightenment thinkers, the thinkers who are deemed to be the princes, shall we say, of the Enlightenment, the likes of Immanuel Kant, the likes of John Locke, the likes of Voltaire. What's your problem with Immanuel Kant?
So so Immanuel Kant is, again, before I wrote the book, I knew it was bad. Like, I just knew it was bad. I had some idea how bad it was. Then you actually read Immanuel Kant. And I do there's a couple of quotes in the book about this. Kant wasn't just a racist. Kant wrote wrote advice to slave owners of how best to beat enslaved Africans based on his crazy racial theories that we had really thick skin. And so it's better to use a stick rather than a whip to inflict the most damage. That's Immanuel Kant. I mean, this is not just a racist, deeply racist, right? He also theorizes, Kant's important because his idea of moral geography, which is the climate's really important. And he goes to extents to say that Africans, not only are we stupid, but we stink, we're backwards, we can't ever have full capacity of humanity, etc. So he kind of is one of the earliest to kind of build this really clear racial hierarchy of the species. Now, the defense of Kant typically is, yeah, he did all that, but his idea about universal theories, that's not racist. That's somehow separate from his really, really racist. The racist part of it was separate from the other part. But that's nonsense. He even said at the time that's not true. Because what he's basically theorizing is saying, look, the white people can think. White people are rational. This is the place where we should look for progress, for science, for reason. And at the end of his life, he comes out against slavery. He comes out against some of the worst brutalities of colonialism. But he does so in the way that a environmentalist would do to protect the habitats of apes, right? Saying, look, now we shouldn't really kill them. We should let them live in their state of nature, their savagery, and we shouldn't be cruel to them. But he has this. If you look at, he's so important to this idea of human rights, which doesn't guarantee you any rights at all, other than the right to be continually exploited and abused. And it's not a coincidence. Like, that is his framework of human rights. And as I said in the book, and I came to this after writing the book, we're actually better off just taking Kant out of our curriculum. Like, you don't need that. It's so bad, that it's so bizarre as well. Some of his theories, for instance, that if planets further away from the sun, the population will be stupider because it's the sun's so important. I mean, it's just nonsense. If you read it, it's just actually crazy. I think the quote in the book I said was trying to salvage his critique of pure reason from the wreckage of his racial theory is like looking for sense on a conspiracy YouTube site. Just get rid of Kant. We don't need it, honestly.
And yet Kant still, and you exist in the academy, you know that in political philosophy departments, you know that in political theory departments, Immanuel Kant is a central figure. Why do you think the academy is so wedded to Kant?
Because the academy is really wedded to white supremacy. Honestly, there's, it's the Enlightenment generally, and Kant's just one example, but the Enlightenment generally is the basis foundation for the modern university, Western university, and the knowledge that goes through. And so this is where people are trained. This is how people, this is the kind of, in the same way that Malcolm X is my basis, Kant is the basis for a lot of the way that people think, and it's deeply problematic. So the idea that if you say to people, let's shift Kant, push Kant, and actually at the time, so I was on the Newsnight. The one time I was trending actually ever on Twitter was when I suggested Immanuel Kant was racist. Immanuel Kant was racist. That's, again, this is historical fact. Just go read Eddie Kant. It's obvious he's racist. And people went insane. And the students at the time at the School of Oriental African Studies, they were just saying, let's have some other thinkers as well. It wasn't let's get rid of Kant at all. It was like, let's just add some other stuff in. And people, even at that suggestion, people went insane.
And how do you explain that, Kente? How do you explain that? You say that it was intense. People went insane, which is an extreme reaction. How do you explain that extreme reaction? Why do you think people are so tied to Immanuel Kant? What is their connection, that deep connection to him, what he represents?
I think Kant is I think because Kant is such a good example of white supremacy in philosophy. And people are tied to white supremacy and white supremacist ideas. People don't like to admit it. People don't want to say it, but people really, really are, right? So if you push on it even a little bit, and I'm not sure why, it's actually interesting, I'm not sure why Kant particularly, because I'm very surprised. When I was trending because I criticized Kant, I was surprised most people even knew who Kant was. I mean, I didn't think he was that mainstream. But I think he's a really good representative of the Enlightenment, of human rights as well, actually, interestingly. And I think he's a stand-in for a bigger problem, is that we are addicted to white supremacist ideas. And if anytime you want to challenge any of those white supremacist ideas, people are not rational about them. But there's no rational defense of any of them. So it becomes irrational very, very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. You talk about there being a number of aspects to this new age of empire. You mention, racial capitalism, colonial nostalgia, racial patriarchy, among others. First of all, just define for us, what is racial capitalism? And a term, of course, made famous by Cedric Robinson.
Yeah, so racial capitalism is Cedric Robinson kind of coins the term, makes it famous. It's used, I mean, really, it's just capitalism. I mean, if we're honest, capitalism is just racism. You can't separate it. But the idea of racial capitalism is that, what's one of the key feature of capital exploitation is race, right? You can't separate the two. And so if you go back to that point I was saying, what is it that defines the West? It is that move into the Americas. It is the genocide. It is slavery that allows the accumulation of capital, which then allows capitalism to exist. Well, if you say those two things are inseparable, then capitalism is racialism. Is racism. You can't separate them. So oftentimes people think about race and class separately, and the whole point of racial capitalism is to say, actually, no, you just can't do. They are like this. They are intertwined completely.
Mm-hmm. And colonial nostalgia.
So that's the idea of looking back, of romanticizing, of wanting to go back to the good old days. In the United States, the best example would be Make America Great Again, or Make America White Again, I guess you could put that in. And in Britain, we just had Brexit. We just left the European Union. And this was so much predicated on the idea of take back control. Britain can be great again when Britannia ruled the waves. There is unfortunately, there's a massive yearning for the olden days. Like in the States, people go and visit slave plantations and like, you can stay. Was in Mississippi? There's one, I can't remember the name, but there's definitely a hotel in the South where you can actually stay in a former slave cabin. And it's got Wi-Fi and it's got like, but it's actually the former slave, and you stay there as a hotel room. I mean, macabre things. In the Caribbean, actually, in Jamaica, where my family's from, there's Rose Hall Plantation, which is one of the most notorious plantation houses. Which, when you go and give a tour around, it's like a tour of a museum, and it's really strange, right? Where, well, I guess it's not strange. It's the same irrationality that people defend Kant, but there is this kind of yearning for the good old days of colonialism.
Is that what the vote for Brexit was?
100%. 100. I mean, maybe not 100%, but at least 75% of it was this
a hankering for empire, like the old days, the good old days of the British Empire.
Yeah, the good old days, make Britain great again. What? Because there's been a massive thing in the UK since mass immigration in the UK is relatively recent, 60s, 70s. Children's even later on, and since then there's been keep Britain white. The idea that we're swamped, the idea that there's too much immigration, and even though the irony again, why these debates are often not rational, the immigration that has been stopped, halted, from leaving the EU is all white people. It's Eastern Europeans. It's nothing to do with Caribbean, nothing to do with Black people, nothing to do with brown people. But if you actually looked at the rhetoric, the posters that were used at the time, it was all Black and brown people. It's like this makes no sense. But it was a very clear, we want to go back to the good old days. And what are the good old days? When Britain was white, when we had our colonies. And even if you look at there was a term that government officials used around the time when they were saying this could be our Empire 2.0. We can re-engage with the Commonwealth and all this. So yeah, it's a massive part. And like I said, at least 75%, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You say that this mythology of the Enlightenment, a kind of magical thinking that exists about the West, you say that it's something that infects both the right, but also the left side of the political spectrum, the so-called progressive left. How so?
Yeah, I mean, well, look, Karl Marx was an Enlightenment thinker. Let's be honest, like we miss out on Marx all the time. But what was Marx's biggest problem? Especially from Cedric Robinson, is he imagined that the savior of history was the white working class, and then created a theory of history that said the white working class would save everybody. Right? There is this deeply problematic idea on the left, which is what you essentially get is here as well when we talk about social democracy. It is how do we share the spoils of colonialism fairer, basically, right? So if you look at, I spent a lot of time in left circles and reading these debates, and the big what sparked a lot of these left protests now is 2008, right? The financial crisis. Before the financial crisis, when everything was okay, the left wasn't that big a deal, right? But then when it starts to become uncomfortable, neoliberalism, and the real heart of these protests and neoliberalism, when you get Thatcherism and Reaganomics, which is all about the individual, and they start and the rich start to steal the wealth. And if you look at the left debates, well, so much of them are about how can we get the wealth back from that top 1%, and how can we put it into public services, et cetera, et cetera. But that misses the point. But this wealth is extracted almost 100% from the colony. So you can have this kind of social democracy in the West, but that doesn't solve any of the problems of racism. In fact,
but it does make life better for some people, does it not? Isn't that part of the argument that by redistributing the resources, by more people having access to these, these kind of fundamental means of life, that they will be able to be more free. They'll be able to kind of fully exercise their agency as human subjects.
Yeah, but here, right? The debates are about here, though, right? If we have to talk about social democracy in England, or social democracy in America, or social democracy in Canada, that's fine. But that doesn't. Most of the world, so most of the world live in conditions that we can't imagine, like literally can't imagine. Most people don't have an inside toilet. The child dies every 10 seconds because they haven't got access to food. 9 million people die per year because of hunger. Far more people died from hunger last year than would die from COVID-19 any year, right? So if all you're talking about is how do we divvy up the spoils of empire better in Britain and America and the West, that doesn't solve any of our problems. My family came to this country under social democracy. A, it was really racist anyway, like it was terrible when they came in here, but B, broadly speaking, in the Caribbean and elsewhere, these are debates, these are internal debates about how do you share the spoils of empire. And haven't seen probably any progressive left politics, which is really about saying, how do we deal with the actual global system, which creates these massive imbalances?
Just as an aside, in your book, you do make reference to COVID-19, and you do express, some consternation, I would say, at the fact that we, and I'm saying the collective we, have been able to find vaccines so quickly for this thing called COVID-19, and yet diseases like malaria have been in existence for decades, and we can't seem to find the magic bullet to solve that problem. What does the way in which we've been able to kind of deal with COVID-19, what does that reveal to you about the world?
Yeah, I mean, this is a perfect example of white supremacy. I have to say, like, again, this isn't criticizing what else you're going to do as a government. You got this, you have to go to these extents because people's lives are in danger, right? But just see the lengths to which you've gone through. We've shut down the economy, which would never have been imaginable. Like literally, we've both had right-wing governments in the Americas, certainly in the United States and in the UK, who've done things that would have made Karl Marx blush, right? It means for a year, people have been paid to be at home. These things which was previously impossible. The vaccine, which everybody said, no chance you'll get a vaccine. It's not possible to get a vaccine that quickly. We got it quicker than they even thought, right? Now, millions of people within a year have been vaccinated. This is what shows you when there's an existential threat to the lives here, you can see what's possible. And if you compare that to malaria, which has existed for more than 100 years, no vaccine. Actually, don't even compare it to things where there are vaccines. Aren't vaccines. 1.5 million people die from TB every year, and there is a vaccine for TB. So, and I said before, 9 million people die from hunger. So this shows you the value of white life. And white life is threatened, we will go to extents. We will make anything possible. But COVID-19 will end, and we'll go back to a world where 9 million people die per year from hunger, and we don't really do anything about it. And not only that, we don't even understand it on racial terms, even though basically all of those 9 million people are Black and brown.
Mm-hmm. You say, quote, "We entirely miss the point if we believe that racism can be overcome with token gestures, commitment to diverse hiring practices, or statements of brand solidarity." Why is that a kind of a superficial understanding of what's required to kind of change the structures that exist in the society?
I mean, I think this is one of the things where, we had the Black Lives Matter summer, and we've had lots of interest in race and lots of books being bought and these statements. And a lot of people see that as progressive and progress. The more I think about it, the more I think it's actually a negative thing, because we have attention on the issue, but what's being happened, right? We've got like all these black squares being posted, NBA players with the Black Lives Matter, football players in here, UK soccer players, you should say, they're taking a knee before games. It doesn't change anything. Nothing has changed. Everything is the same. The best example of it would be companies like L'Oreal and Unilever changing the name of their skin lightening products to take out the word fair, as though that's progressive. It's still a skin lightening product. They're still selling product which bleach people's skin who are dark to make them lighter. They just changed the name, right? But this is about you're rebranding a racist product. And that's all we've really done. We haven't addressed any of the global imbalances about production chains, about poverty, about anything. We've just made these vapid commitments to change.
And yet I'm wondering if you're a bit too cynical and you're a bit too pessimistic. You are the head of a Black Studies program, the first Black Studies program in Europe. you clearly have invested a lot of time and energy in creating space for yourself. It's taken a lot of work to build this institution. And so you seem to be manifesting the importance of representation. Clearly, being in the position that you are as a professor, I'm sure that you've inspired young people, right, who have been moved by your writing, by your example. So are you saying that Dr. Kehinde Andrews' presence at Birmingham City University is meaningless?
I definitely need to resign. Now, if that's what it is, I definitely need to resign 100%. Yeah, no, I guess I am, right? No, in some ways I am. But I feel we're not. I mean, it's odd, right? Again, the contradiction. Because no, look, the truth is, hey, okay, so I am in this job. I am a professor. It's awful. Like, geez, I'm still Black. In fact, since I got promoted, it's been worse. I'm not sure I'd recommend it to anybody. The not even just microaggressions, the actual aggressions you have to go through, the way that you get treated. Honestly, the last 3 years since starting Black Studies, internally, it's been awful. I mean, awful. I mean, I spoke about this a number of times, and I often wonder whether it's worth it. If I'm 100% honest, the other stuff, the working with students, the writing and stuff, that's been great. But actually, internally, it's really these institutions are really, really hostile.
What I'm suggesting is what I'm suggesting, Kehinde, is your presence matters to people. It's significant. It's important to individual lives. Is it not?
Yeah, but it should have been. It should. I mean, when I got promoted, I had to have a whole thing in my class because they were like this Black Studies students were celebrated. I had to literally, it was a 3-hour lecture where at the end of it, at the start of it, they were celebrating, at the end of it, they were all depressed. So I was like, what does this actually mean? Like, okay, I get promoted to professor, that's good for me, I get paid more, but what did you get? What did anybody else gain from me being professor?
I'm going to tell you, because there are people who are still around. My dad is 84, right? He taught at the university.
Okay.
And I'm sure your parents, how old they are. There are people who remember a time when Black folks like you could not occupy that space. They would not even be in that kind of position. They would not have that kind of platform that you have, where you're able to even be on a place like Newsnight, where you can actually have an impact on the discourse. Your presence is maybe allowing other people to more fully express their humanity, to express their freedom. Does that not count for something?
No, it does. I know. I don't want to be so pessimistic. Like, obviously, I don't want to be there at all. I think hopefully it does. Hopefully, I would say hopefully it does. But there is a reality here where, the truth is, if I know how I got professor, mostly it's luck. Mostly, like a lot of it's luck. It's like a set of circumstances that will be difficult to replicate. And the reality is, if I'm honest to people, the chances of somebody like me becoming a professor are really low. Like, they're still there. It's not great, right? And I'm not sure the extent to which we keep trying to measure progress through how many of us can get into these roles. I just don't think it's a good way to measure progress. I really don't, actually. I think what we should be doing is saying, well, how can we build things externally? This is why I say I do worry about that role as professor, because please don't take me as somebody as a sign of progress. I don't think I am, honestly. I would hope that I can use my leverage in this position to do stuff which inspires people, to be helpful. But I hope I'm not inspiring people to think let's get more faith in these institutions, because these institutions aren't the solution. The solution has to be stuff outside of this, and that's from somebody who's been in the institution for a long time and understands the limitations of it.
So we began our conversation talking about those 3 cute kids that you have, who were celebrating the fact that their father has just produced this new book online. When you imagine the kind of world that you're trying to build for them, right? When you imagine that world, what does that world look like, and how do we get to that world?
I mean, it's tricky, isn't it? One of the so definitely in a very concrete, like, short-term way, like, I've very much been like, Back to Black was about what does Black radical politics look like, and that looks like building alternatives. It looks like we started the Harambee organization of Black Unity. We have a website now called Make It Plain, where we write our own stuff and put stuff out there. Look, that's what I'd like to see grow, like an independent organization that we control and can put education out there. And I would love, 100% love, for my kids to be able to work in that organization. That's what I would say to me. If we built something that can work and sustain us, I'd work in it, and that's what we should be trying to do. Rather than me just say to them, follow in my footsteps and be a professor, I actually think it'd be much better if we said, look, actually we can build other things you can be part of, and then decide what our future looks like. Because without those kind of alternative alternative organizations, we can't build the world that we need to build.
And what? But again, I'm gonna press you a little bit more, right? And I want you to put some meat on the bones of that. So again, what is that world comprised of? How is it different from the world in which we're living? Because, for example, in your book you talk about the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is an idea that has been presented by the likes of Naomi Klein. Bernie Sanders is someone who is supportive of the idea of the Green New Deal, like a radical change in terms of how we engage with our environment and structure our economy. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez as well is someone who's very much supportive of the Green New Deal. You, though, are somewhat skeptical about it and about its sustainability, I suppose, as an idea, as a movement. So is the Green New Deal not enough for you? It doesn't go far enough? Is it part of your imagining of what this new world will look like?
The Green New Deal is a good idea. Like, I want to say, a lot of things aren't radical, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad idea. Green New Deal is a good idea. I would always support Green New Deal policies. The problem is, it's about America, it's about Britain, it's about here. It doesn't deal with the global problem, right? If I'm being totally utopian, I did do a video for the BBC a few years ago about African utopias. What does that look like? And a big thing of what that looks like for Black radical politics is about an Africa that has no borders, isn't all these nation states which are all cut off each other, is an Africa which has solidarity within. So Africa is the richest continent in the world, has all the resources it needs, can actually take itself out of the world system because it has everything you need in Africa with a planned economy, with a green economy. So yeah, green is definitely a big part of that. But I think if we're saying, well, how do anti-Black racism is such a massive part of the problem, the only way to solve that is to have a liberated Africa, which isn't being chunks taken out of it by China and India and the West, that can control its own resources, and that can build prosperity. That's I mean, if I'm being totally utopian, that's really the only solution to that problem.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned China there, and China. You do address the China issue a little bit in your book, and you basically kind of talk about China as being part of this new age of imperialism.
Yeah, China's maybe worse than Europe. I mean, the big thing I'm trying to push in the book is, although white supremacy doesn't just benefit white people, it never has. There's always been Black and brown people who've been slightly better off, who've engaged in the system in order to enrich themselves. And if you look at China, not China, the whole of China, it's the Chinese elite. This is essentially what they've done, right? Chairman Mao dies in 1976, and Mao's policies are buried with him. Revolutionary China disappears at that point, and China makes a decision that we can gain some kind of prosperity from joining the Western economic system. And how do they do that? They do that by becoming the workshop of the world, where they manufacture the goods for everybody. But why is it that the goods are manufactured in China? Because there's 400 million Chinese people in desperate poverty who work in sweatshops who can take wages that we would never accept in the West. So that's racial. That's racialized. The fact that Chinese government and the Chinese elite are benefiting off the racialized exploitation of millions of Chinese people doesn't mean it's not racialized. And then the second piece of that is, well, if you're going to manufacture the goods for the world, you have to then have the resources for the world. And where do they come from? Same places Europe got them from, Africa. And if you look at China's involvement in Africa, particularly since they joined the World Trade Organization, another example of why China's in the West, not outside of the West, they've just been stealing resources from Africa for a long time, for the last 20 years, and further impoverishing the African continent and enriching themselves. There's a model that China's developing itself, which is based solely on white supremacy and joining the West, not changing the West or undermining the West.
So what do ordinary Africans do to resist the invasion, this new invasion of these imperialist forces?
I mean, this is difficult, right? Because I mean, any people who are struggling, it's day to day, right? Like this is the problem that we find ourselves in here oftentimes. When you're the most oppressed and exploited, it's difficult. Your day to day is trying to survive, and in the African continent, it's no different, right? And so this is where actually diaspora is really important, connecting up. I said my politics is generally Black radical, but connecting up the dots and trying to bring everybody together. But it does mean a politics which, what's the problem in that? This is actually ironically, what the problem in Africa is many fold, but one of the folds is certainly the elite who are in the position to make these deals with China, to make these deals with the West, to keep people impoverished. That needs to end. You do need to have a political revolution on the African continent, which brings together the African continent rather than has these national sides. If I can say one thing Africa needs, actually one thing that Africa's always needed, ironically, is Black consciousness. Like before, actually, I think the point in the book where I point is that had Africa had Black consciousness at any point, slavery don't happen, colonialism can't really happen, and what's happening now couldn't really happen. So
explain what you mean when you say had it had Black consciousness, because Steve Biko was the head of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. There have been other Black consciousness or organizations, groupings in Africa. So what do you mean when you say that there hasn't been a sufficient amount of that kind of consciousness?
Yeah, sufficient amount. So if you go back to when Europe first goes into Africa, I said Europe was behind Africa. Europe couldn't take over. There's a reason why colonialism is less than 100 years in most countries. Like direct, we run your country, is less than 100 years in most African countries, because Europe could not just march into Congo and take over. Didn't have the power, right? What Europe did have and was able to use was the fact that Africans didn't see themselves as the same people, because they're not the same people. This is the thing. Whiteness and Europeans had a system where they all kind of fought each other, but agreed on the basic premise that we're better than everybody else and we'll work together on that level. And then Africa doesn't have that. It has different ethnic groups, different nations who are competing against each other and don't organize. If at this point they'd all unified and said, "No, by Europe, we don't," they couldn't. Literally, slavery could not have happened. But we've always clung to our division rather than say, "Let's come together." And the same, if you can say the same thing in the 60s when there is, the 50s, 60s, we do have lots of Black consciousness ideas, Pan-Africanism, revolutionary ideas of Pan-Africanism on the African continent. But the honest truth is that loses out to the nation state, to the ethnic divisions. And you haven't had this kind of unification of Black people in the same way that you have had on the West, where even though they're fighting each other, they generally agree on the main principles. And with a unified African continent is a continent that could not be controlled in the way that it is now, and the way that it has been historically.
At the end of your book, The New Age of Empire, you say, in the end, Malcolm was right when he warned us that it will be, quote, the ballot or the bullet, liberty or death, freedom for everybody, or freedom for nobody. What do you mean when you say that?
So the publishers asked me to be more positive at the end. that was the best I could do, right? No, so the reason why I love Malcolm, but two, I think that's a great quote, because what he's reminding of us is that empires fall. In fact, one of the things we need to get rid of our head immediately is that there is no alternative. The West has only been predominant for a couple of 100 years. It's a blip on the human timeline of history. There are many alternatives. This empire will fall at some point. It will either fall through revolution, because it gets overtaken, it will collapse under its own weight. And one of the slivers of optimism which I do have is that if you actually look at the climate crisis and what's generating it, it is this idea of acquisition that we can keep exploiting, that we can keep building. And that is a deeply white supremacist idea. And it is
endless growth,
right? And that's so much tied into capital and whiteness and production and the mastery of the world, etc., that if you actually step back and say, well, let's just stop doing this. Let's think of a new way to run the economy, because if we don't, we're going to fall into the abyss. We're literally going to end the world. Then maybe that is the wake-up call that the West needs to think. Because what Malcolm's saying in his speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, is that, look, the West is the only place in the world that's had the chance to have a non-violent revolution. Like, the arguments are there. People are saying we need this and that. Just listen, change, reframe, rethink. Malcolm wasn't very optimistic. I'm not that optimistic that's going to happen, but it's definitely possible. But the other part of that is, look, like I said, empires end, and one thing I do want to say of the book, it's not pessimistic. It seems a bit pessimistic because it's all doom and gloom and the West is racist, etc., etc. But the purpose of that is to say, once we understand the scale of the problem, that this trying to reform this system is a dead end, then we can have a proper, real, radical imaginary and say, well, actually, how do we fix this? How do we truly fix this? And rather just try to put sticking plasters on it. That's a radical, that's an optimistic idea.
You think human transformation is possible?
No, revolution is possible. Like, absolutely. Like, and if you think about 50 years ago, we could have had a revolution. I mean, it was not clear that the West would survive. You had communism, you had Pan-Africanism, you had these radical movements everywhere. and there is a reaction from the various states, right, which is largely violent, about killing people, etc. There's another reaction which is about, this is how we get the welfare state, ironically, right? Like, to pacify people, you give them independence, you give them tax breaks, you give them benefits. You know, there's a kind of pacification process. You let people in, people like me, etc., right, to some extent. But 50 years ago, when Malcolm was talking about revolution, this was not pie in the sky. So in 50 years from today, if we decide we want to do something different, build alternative organizations, have different ideas, we could be in a place where, of course, we could have something new. Things happen. New revolution is possible. That would be the message from the book.
In the wake of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, we saw the resurgence, really, of the Black Lives Matter movement. What do you make of the movement, and what does the movement mean to you?
I mean, it's wonderful to see so many young people out on the streets, because I think prior to Black Lives Matter, it's not racial. It's always been protests of racial justice, but they've gone a bit underground. Whereas now you're seeing thousands of young people coming out and saying, "Look, no, we've had enough." And I think this generation understand, because we've had so many reforms. We've got Black and Black middle class. We've got Black elected officials, and I think they understand the limits of that. All of those things have happened, but the problems are still exactly the same, right? So I think this generation understand that we need to have transformation. I mean, I think in terms of Black Lives Matter generally, if I'm honest, it's a liberal movement, it's a reformist movement. Generally, it is a, can we get things changed internally? But I think if it carries on, and with the passion that you see in the young people, it will have to become radical, because you cannot solve these problems within these systems.
Mm-hmm. This new book of yours, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. The book is out. It's out in the world. It's out in the world. People are engaging with this book now. Obviously we're having this conversation. What do you want this book to do? What kind of difference do you want this book to make? How do you want it to affect the discourse?
I want the book to make people uncomfortable. I think that's the key thing. And you should end the book feeling uncomfortable, because there's so much, the big problem we have now is the way we're talking about race, and there's this narrative somehow that it's all kind of easy to solve, that there's these steps you can take as a white ally, and you can't. I've read so many books where it kind of ends on this really positive, cheery note. That's not what we need. You need to be uncomfortable. We need to understand the scale and the stakes of what this is. It's kind of like stripping back so that we can look forward. That's the purpose of this book. So I hope the book makes people uncomfortable and understand the scale of change that's necessary.
Dr. Kehinde Andrews, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a delight.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.